Day 55. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and in the past week, a detail that most coverage has moved past is beginning to demand a very specific answer. Somewhere in the month of January 2026, a work crew entered Nancy Guthrie's home. They were there for electrical work, according to reporting by investigative journalist Dave Mack on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace. They moved through her rooms. They saw where the cameras were mounted. They understood the layout of a house where an 4-year-old woman lived alone with limited mobility, dependent on daily medication. And a few weeks after that crew left, someone sent a ransom note to multiple news outlets that contained details about what was inside that house, details that you cannot learn by standing on a sidewalk. That is not the question every other channel is asking. Most coverage has focused on the masked figure captured on Nancy's doorbell camera, the backpack, the holstered gun, the gloved hands reaching up to cover the lens. That figure matters, but this video is asking a different question, one that has been sitting in the background of this investigation for 55 days without a clear answer. The ransom note knew things. The question is, who told it those things and why? After nearly 2 months, that question remains unanswered. If you have been following this case from the beginning, stay with us, because we are going to a place most coverage has not gone. If this is the first time you are hearing Nancy Guthrie's name, we will give you everything you need in the next 2 minutes. Either way, what comes next matters. If you want to follow every development as it breaks, subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications is the fastest way to stay ahead of this story. The speed recap, for anyone coming in now. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old, the mother of Today's Show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, and she lived alone in a quiet residential area called Catalina Foothills in Tucson, Arizona. She had limited mobility. Her own sheriff would later note that she could not walk 50 yards on her own. She relied on daily medication and wore a pacemaker that synced continuously with her phone. On the evening of January 31st, her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni dropped her home after a family dinner at her daughter Annie's house. That was the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie. Sometime in the early hours of February 1st, her pacemaker stopped syncing with her devices at 2:28 inches the morning. Her doorbell camera disconnected around the same time. When her family arrived at the house later that day, after she failed to appear for an online church service with a friend, they found her phone, her wallet, and her daily medication on a surface inside the home. Her back doors had been propped open. Blood on the front porch tested positive for Nancy's DNA. The Pima County Sheriff, Chris Nanos, stood before cameras and said he believed she had been taken against her will. The FBI joined the investigation that same week. On February 10th, FBI Director Kash Patel released footage recovered from Nancy's Nest doorbell camera footage that showed a masked individual, face covered except for the eyes and mouth, wearing a jacket, gloves, long pants, a holstered pistol, and a black 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack. The person appeared to tamper with the camera before approaching the front door. The FBI described that person as a suspect. His height was estimated at 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches. His identity, as of today, remains unknown. In the days following the disappearance, ransom notes began arriving at media outlets. TMZ received one. Local Tucson stations, KOLD and KGUN 9, received others. The notes demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin, with 2 deadlines, 5 p.m. on February 5th and 5 p.m. on February 9th. Both passed without confirmed contact. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings posted a video on February 7th in which she addressed what appeared to be the captors directly, saying that the family had received a message, that they understood, and that they would pay. The family later announced a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. All members of the Guthrie family were cleared as suspects by February 16th. As of this week, 55 days in, no one has been arrested. The FBI has scaled back personnel in Tucson and relocated its command post to Phoenix. Cadaver dogs have been suspended. The investigation continues, but the ground search phase, the visible, urgent phase, has quietly wound down. That is where every other recap ends, but here is where this video begins. Because in the last several days, a detail has emerged that, when placed next to everything else we know, changes the shape of the question entirely. The ransom note did not just demand money. It described things. And describing those things required being somewhere that a stranger, arriving for the first time in the dark at 2 inches the morning, would have no reason to know. There is a phrase that investigators use when they are trying to understand how a crime was planned, and the phrase is operational knowledge. It refers to the specific, granular information that someone needs before they can execute a crime with precision, not general knowledge, not publicly available information, but the kind of detail that only comes from proximity, from observation, from being inside the space, or from someone who was. In the case of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the ransom notes that arrived at multiple news outlets in the days after February 1st contained what investigators and analysts began describing as operational knowledge. According to reporting by TMZ, which received one of the first notes, the message included details about items connected to Nancy Guthrie, details specific enough that Harvey Levin, TMZ's founder, referenced them on air as a reason to take the note seriously. Savannah Guthrie herself, in her first interview since her mother's disappearance, told Today colleague Hoda Kotb that she believed the two notes her family responded to were real, distinguishing them from a larger volume of correspondence she described as, in her understanding, not genuine. She said that most of the notes were not real, but the ones her family answered, she tended to believe those. What made those notes feel different is the question worth sitting with. The person who wrote a note that a grieving family chose to respond to, a note that Savannah Guthrie publicly acknowledged by saying, "We received your message and we understand and we will pay," was not writing in generalities. They were writing with a degree of specificity that Savannah Guthrie found credible. And credibility of that kind, in a ransom context, does not come from reading news articles. The demand itself is worth examining on its own terms. The note received by KGUN9 reportedly demanded $6 million in Bitcoin, with a specific wallet address included and a hard deadline attached. Bitcoin was chosen deliberately, and the choice reveals something about whoever made it. According to cryptocurrency expert Ravi Sarathy of Northeastern University, Bitcoin has become attractive in ransom scenarios precisely because of its global reach, its speed, and what he described as its pseudo-anonymous nature. But the same transparency that makes it attractive to criminals also makes it traceable. Every transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain is public and permanently recorded. Blockchain forensics experts like Bezalel Athan Raviv, CEO of Lionsgate Network, told multiple outlets that including a wallet address in a ransom note was a critical error, the kind of mistake that gives investigators something actionable from the moment the note is received. The FBI and its partners were monitoring that wallet. And on February 11th, a transaction of approximately $152 in Bitcoin was recorded in that wallet's publicly viewable logs, according to reporting by AZ Family and TMZ. Where that money came from and who sent it was not disclosed. There is also a linguistic detail that one retired FBI agent flagged to the New York Post. According to that outlet's reporting, the ransom note used the term USD rather than a dollar sign, which the agent described as unusual for someone native to the United States. It is the kind of phrasing that a person unfamiliar with American financial conventions might default to. The agent suggested it could indicate someone from overseas, or alternatively, that the note was not genuine. That detail remains unresolved. But step back from the note for a moment and look at what it would have required to write it. The person who composed a message credible enough for the Guthrie family to respond to publicly needed to know things about that house. They needed to know enough to make Savannah Guthrie, a journalist with years of professional skepticism, say on national television that she believed it. That level of familiarity with a private residence does not come from driving past the neighborhood. It comes from access. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos said in an interview with NBC Nightly News that investigators believe the attack was targeted, that they believe they know why the suspect chose that house on that night. He said they were not 100% certain, and he said it would be foolish to tell the public they were safe, simply because this happened to the Guthrie family. The word he used was targeted. He did not say why. He has not said why. And that silence, sustained across 55 days and dozens of press inquiries, is its own kind of signal. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, who has been publicly analyzing this case, told Newsweek that in her assessment this appears to be an inside job and that she does not believe the person captured on the doorbell camera acted alone. Retired Detective Rick Castigar, speaking on the Brian Enton Investigates podcast, pointed to the way the suspect moved in the footage approaching with one shoulder angled toward the camera, turning his head in a specific direction, and said, "That tells him the person knew exactly where the camera was. That is not behavior consistent with someone encountering an unfamiliar property for the first time. That is behavior consistent with someone who had already been there, or who had been told precisely what to expect." And then there is the crew that was inside the house. According to investigative reporter Dave Mack, speaking on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, an electrician's work crew was present inside Nancy Guthrie's home during the month of January 2026, conducting security-related electrical work. The precise dates of that work have not been publicly confirmed. The identities of the crew members have not been released. Nancy Grace noted directly that the crew's presence inside the home, followed by Nancy's disappearance, demands investigation. Whether that investigation has produced anything of significance has not been disclosed by law enforcement. That is the shape of the question at the center of this video. Not who wore the mask, not who carried the backpack, but who drew the map. If you are watching this, and something about that question feels familiar, if you have seen something, heard something, or if you live in the Tucson area and remember anything unusual in January, the FBI tip line is 1800-CALLFBI. The Guthrie family is offering a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. No detail is too small. That is a direct quote from her family. Now, here is where the investigation itself begins to complicate the question in ways that have not received nearly enough attention. For weeks, law enforcement asked residents near Nancy Guthrie's home to check their security systems for footage from a specific date, the evening of January 11th. The request was unusual in its specificity, and for a period it appeared to be grounded in something concrete. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department had been working with Google, which owns the Nest camera system, to recover footage from Nancy's doorbell camera footage that had been partially lost or corrupted, and that was eventually retrieved from what the Sheriff's Department described as back-end systems. According to reporting by NBC News correspondent Liz Kreutz, Google initially told investigators that one particular image, an image showing a masked figure outside Nancy's home who was not wearing a backpack, unlike the figure captured on the night of the abduction, may have been recorded on January 11th. That would place the suspect at the property 3 weeks before he allegedly returned to take her. Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood with that date in mind. They asked residents within a 2-mile radius to pull footage from January 11th specifically, focusing on the hours between 9 p.m. and midnight. A neighbor-organized effort cross-referenced footage from multiple homes. A neighbor named Aldine Meister told Fox News Digital that she had noticed a strange man walking through the neighborhood in mid-January, someone who, in her words, did not have your typical walking gear on and had his hat pulled really far over his eyes. Then Google walked it back. According to Sheriff Nanos, in a statement reported by NBC News, Google later told investigators that it could not definitively assign that image to January 11th or any specific date. The company said the date had been a possibility, not a confirmation. Nanos publicly acknowledged the reversal, and yet, and this matters, the sheriff did not abandon the date entirely. He told KOLD News that investigators still believe something occurred on January 11th, based on the FBI's own analysis of the equipment and the digital evidence, separate from what Google provided. The family itself, in a statement released on March 21st and reported by KVOA News 4 Tucson, specifically asked the community to search their memories around the key timelines of January 31st, the early morning hours of February 1st, and the late evening of January 11th. If January 11th represents a trial, run a night when someone returned to confirm camera positions, confirm that Nancy was home, confirm that the layout matched whatever information they had already been given, then the person who went to that house 3 weeks early did so with a level of commitment that former FBI agent Coffindaffer described in a post on X as telling. She wrote that this tells us how committed the suspect was, that it was such a risky move, and that if he had been seen on the 11th, maybe Nancy would have never been taken. There are 2 dates before the abduction that now carry weight in this investigation. A day when a crew with legitimate access was inside the house, and a night when someone who had no legitimate reason to be there may have been standing at her door. The gap between those 2 events is narrow. The gap between those events and the night of January 31st is narrower still. That is the question this investigation has not answered. Someone built a plan around a specific house, a specific woman, a specific night. And the architecture of that plan required knowledge that only comes from somewhere inside. There is a question about the Bitcoin wallet that, in 55 days of coverage across every major outlet, has almost never been asked directly. Not whether the wallet is traceable, that question has been answered, and the answer is yes. Not whether investigators are monitoring it, they are. The question is simpler and more unsettling than either of those. When was that wallet created? Bitcoin wallet addresses carry metadata. Every transaction on the blockchain is time-stamped and publicly recorded, and while the identity of a wallet's owner is not automatically visible, the history of the wallet, when it was first used, when funds moved in or out, what addresses it has interacted with, is permanently accessible to anyone with the tools to read it. Blockchain forensics firms like Chainalysis and Lionsgate Network have those tools, and law enforcement has access to both. According to Madeline Kennedy, Vice President of Communications at Chainalysis, speaking to CBS News, "It is a common misconception that Bitcoin is untraceable in reality," she said. "It is the exact opposite. Every single transaction moving between wallets is visible. The blockchain is, in her description, similar to a bank ledger. So when investigators received a ransom note containing a specific Bitcoin wallet address, they did not receive a dead end. They received a thread. And the thread begins not with the transaction that happened, that small deposit of approximately $152 recorded on February 11th, confirmed by AZ Family and TMZ, but with the moment the wallet was opened. If that wallet was created before January 31st, before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, then whoever held it was not improvising. They were preparing. They had already built the financial infrastructure for a ransom demand before the crime was committed. That is a different category of criminal than the one who acts on impulse and scrambles to extract money afterward. Bezalel Athan Raviv, founder and CEO of Lionsgate Network, told Page 6 that providing a crypto wallet address in a ransom context was what he called showing your Achilles to everyone who understands blockchain forensics. He said that the moment you want to cash out cryptocurrency, it has to be met with a crypto exchange, and at that point of conversion, the anonymity collapses. In the United States, crypto exchanges are subject to know your customer regulations that require government identification, date of birth, and home address. Law enforcement can subpoena that data. The path from wallet to identity is not guaranteed to be short, but it exists. The question of why, after 55 days, that path has not produced a public arrest is one that investigators have declined to address directly. What they have addressed, piece by piece, is the physical evidence recovered at and near the scene. The gloves are worth understanding in detail because they illustrate precisely the kind of investigative false dawn that has characterized this case from the beginning. A pair of gloves was found approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, and preliminary testing indicated the presence of DNA from an unknown male. The discovery felt significant. Then, the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that the DNA had been traced to a local restaurant worker who, in the sheriff's words, was not considered part of the investigation. A dead end, arrived at after days of analysis. Additional gloves recovered in the area are reportedly being tested at a private laboratory in Florida, according to Fox News Digital, and those results have not been released. The forensic genetic genealogy effort is the most technically sophisticated tool currently in play. The technique works by comparing partial DNA recovered from a crime scene against public genealogy databases, constructing family trees backward from distant relatives until a candidate identity emerges. It is the same method that identified Brian Kohberger as the suspect in the 2022 University of Idaho murders. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Lance Lasing told CBS News that the process takes a while, that it is not the kind of tool that produces results on a news cycle. DNA submitted from Nancy's home returned what Sheriff Nanos described as minimal results from what investigators believed was their best target for suspect material. Other samples remain in analysis. There is also the matter of the camera itself, not the footage, but the physical unit. The doorbell camera's hardware was missing from the property, according to CNN's early coverage of the investigation. The footage that the FBI eventually released on February 10th was not pulled from a camera that was there when investigators arrived. It was reconstructed from what the Pima County Sheriff's Department described as residual data located in back-end systems, recovered through collaboration with private sector partners. That process forensically extracting footage from cloud infrastructure after a physical process of 4 device has been removed is not a standard step in a residential missing persons case. It is the kind of technical effort that gets made when investigators believe the footage is worth fighting for. And it was. The footage produced the only known images of the suspect. But removing a camera is not something most people think to do. Taking a physical device, not just covering it or disabling it, but physically removing it, suggests an awareness that footage could survive the tampering. That is knowledge of how networked security systems work. It is the kind of knowledge that someone learns from experience, from research, or from someone who has that experience already. On a neighbor's security system, approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home, a car was recorded speeding past at 2:36 inches the morning on February 1st, 8 minutes after Nancy's pacemaker sent its last signal, according to Fox News Digital. Sheriff Nanos, when asked about the vehicle, said his department was aware of it and looking into it, placing it alongside what he described as hundreds of thousands of other vehicles that were out driving at that hour. No description of the car has been publicly released. No connection to the case has been confirmed. What you are left with, after working through each of these threads, is not a picture of a crime that is difficult to solve because the evidence is thin. It is a picture of a crime that is difficult to solve because the evidence points inward towards someone who had access, who had knowledge, who had time, and because that category of person has not yet been publicly named. If you want to stay with every development as it comes in, this channel will cover each one. Subscribing now means you will not have to go looking, because the complications do not stop with the physical evidence. They extend into the investigation itself, into the public statements of the officials running it, and into a set of contradictions that have grown harder to reconcile the longer this case continues. Begin with the ransom notes, because their status is genuinely unresolved in a way that rarely gets acknowledged. Multiple notes were sent to multiple outlets in the days following February 1st. The first, received by TMZ and 2 Tucson television stations, demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin with 2 deadlines. A second note was determined to be fraudulent, and the person who sent it was arrested, according to Fortune's reporting. A third message arrived at TMZ asking for 1 Bitcoin in exchange for information about the kidnapper, not claiming involvement but claiming knowledge, a different and stranger proposition entirely, according to Charles Latibaudiere, co-executive producer at TMZ, who described its tone as clearly different from the original ransom communication. The FBI never publicly confirmed that any of the notes were genuine communications from whoever took Nancy Guthrie. Investigators said they were examining the notes for authenticity. That examination, as far as the public record shows, never produced a definitive public statement. Savannah Guthrie, in her interview with Hoda Kotb, drew a distinction between the volume of notes that arrived most of, which she understood to be fake, and the 2 that her family responded to, which she said she tended to believe were real. Tended to believe. That is not certainty. That is a woman who has spent nearly 2 months trying to read signals from people who may or may not have her mother, trying to decide what is worth trusting. The family's February 7th video, in which Savannah stood with her siblings and said, "We received your message and we understand and this is very valuable to us and we will pay," was addressed to someone. Whether that someone was real, or was the same person whose note the FBI later treated as a possible lead, or was someone unconnected to the actual abduction, is a question that has not been answered publicly. The deadlines passed. The contact stopped. The silence that followed has never been explained. Then there is Sheriff Chris Nanos, whose public statements have created a pattern that is difficult to read cleanly. On one hand, he has said repeatedly, and with apparent conviction, that investigators believe they know why the suspect targeted Nancy Guthrie's home, and that this belief has not diminished from day one. On the other hand, he has also warned the community that the suspect could absolutely strike again, that people should keep their wits about them, and that the fact that this happened to the Guthrie family does not mean others are safe. Those 2 positions exist in genuine tension with each other. A targeted crime, by definition, means that a specific victim was chosen for specific reasons. A warning to the general public implies that those reasons could apply to others. Which is it, and why has neither position been clarified in nearly 2 months? Nanos has been publicly reticent about the investigation's progress in ways that have drawn criticism from multiple directions. A recall effort against him is underway, according to Fox 10 Phoenix, driven in part by frustration with the handling of the case and its public communications. Nanos has acknowledged missteps while defending the overall direction of the investigation. He told NBC Nightly News in March that investigators are definitely closer. Closer to what and by how much, he did not say. The FBI's reduced presence in Tucson has been interpreted in competing ways. Some retired agents have suggested that scaling back ground operations and moving the command structure to Phoenix indicates a shift toward analytical work, laboratory analysis, blockchain forensics, genealogy, rather than active field search. Retired FBI agent Lance Lasing offered this more charitable reading to CBS News, saying he would like to be hopeful that the silence means they are on to something. But he acknowledged the alternative, that the silence means the trail has genuinely gone cold, that momentum is harder to sustain when weeks pass without a development that can be shared publicly, and that fighting for new leads in a case this old requires a kind of institutional will that is not guaranteed to last. The cadaver dogs were suspended. The FBI tip line has received more than 13,000 calls, and the most recent surge over 1,500 tips after the family announced the $1 million reward is still being reviewed. The family continues to ask. The investigators continue to say they are working. And somewhere between those two poles of public statement, the actual state of this investigation is being conducted in a silence that, after 55 days, is beginning to feel less like operational caution, and more like the quiet that settles over a case when the easiest answers have been exhausted. There is one thread, though, that has not been exhausted. One thread that connects the ransom note to the electrical crew to the possible January 11th visit to the camera that was taken rather than just covered. It runs through all of it, and it leads not to the person who wore the mask, but to the person who told him what he needed to know before he ever put it on. Consider what it would take to plan this crime from the beginning. Not from the moment the masked figure appeared at the door, but from the actual beginning, the moment someone decided that Nancy Guthrie's home was the right target, that the family had the means to pay $6 million, and that the extraction of that payment was worth the planning required to execute it. That decision was not made on January 31st. It was made earlier, possibly much earlier. And the person who made it needed to answer a specific set of questions before they could commit to it. They needed to know the layout of the house. They needed to know where the cameras were positioned, which ones were hardwired and which were networked, whether the footage was stored locally or in the cloud. They needed to know the pattern of Nancy's days, when she had visitors, when she was alone, when she was most vulnerable. They needed to know that an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility, living by herself in a residential neighborhood, could be removed from that house in the middle of the night without triggering an immediate response. And they needed to know that the family on the other end of the ransom demand had both the financial capacity and the emotional willingness to pay. Every one of those questions has an answer that requires proximity, not surveillance from a car parked down the street. Proximity, the kind that comes from being inside a space, or from someone who has been. Now hold that frame and walk through the sequence of what is known in the order it occurred. During the month of January 2026, according to investigative reporter Dave Mack speaking on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, an electrical work crew was present inside Nancy Guthrie's home, conducting what was described as security-related work. The dates of that work have not been publicly confirmed. The identities of those workers have not been released. What is known is that at some point in January, people with no familial connection to Nancy Guthrie were moving through her rooms, working on systems connected to her home's security infrastructure. At some point, possibly January 11th, possibly another date in January, with the exact timing still contested between Google's initial assessment and its subsequent retraction, a figure appeared outside Nancy Guthrie's home who was not wearing a backpack. That detail matters because the suspect captured on the doorbell camera on the night of the abduction was wearing a backpack. The figure in the earlier image was not. 2 visits, or 1 visit recorded twice, or a single visit whose date cannot be pinned down. Investigators have been unable or unwilling to resolve this publicly. What Sheriff Nanos said, despite Google's reversal, is that he still believes something occurred on January 11th, based on the FBI's own independent analysis of the equipment and the digital evidence recovered from the property. On January 23rd, according to footage circulating from a Ring camera approximately 4 miles from Nancy's home, a figure carrying what observers noted appeared to be a similar backpack to the one worn by the suspect was recorded at 4:19 inches the morning. That footage has not been officially confirmed as connected to the investigation. And then, on the night of January 31st, the person returned with a backpack, a loaded weapon, and a specific wallet address, already prepared to receive millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The wallet existed before the crime was committed. The demand was structured before Nancy Guthrie was taken. The operational details in the note, the details that Savannah Guthrie found credible enough to respond to publicly, were assembled before the masked figure ever approached that door. Whoever composed that note was not improvising in the hours after an abduction. They were executing a plan that had been built over weeks, with information that had been gathered methodically from sources that remain unidentified. This is what the title of this video means. The person who knew about the account did not learn about it from reading a ransom note. They were part of its creation, and that places them inside the planning of this crime, not at its visible edge. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffin-Daffer, who has followed this case closely, described it to Newsweek as consistent with an inside job, stating that she does not believe the person on the doorbell camera acted alone. Former Detective Kurt Dabb, speaking publicly about the case, suggested that based on his experience, the operation as described would be difficult for a single individual to carry out, and estimated that as many as 4 people could have been involved in what he called a targeted abduction. Former Detective Rick Castigar pointed to the suspect's deliberate physical movement in the footage, the angled shoulder, the turned head, as evidence that the person had been told exactly where to look and exactly what to avoid. These are not fringe interpretations. These are assessments from people who have spent careers reading crime scenes, and they are all pointing in the same direction. Sheriff Nanos said he believes he knows why this house was targeted. He has held that belief since day one. He has not shared it. In 55 days, through dozens of press briefings and television interviews, he has protected that specific piece of information with a consistency that itself communicates something. Investigators protect information when sharing. It would give an advantage to someone who is still free. They protect it when the motive, made public, would either warn the suspect or compromise an active lead that is still being pursued. After 55 days, the motive is still protected, which means either the lead it protects is still alive or the habit of protection has outlasted its original purpose. What Nanos has said, when pressed, is this: "We believe we know why he did this. We believe it was targeted. Do not think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you are safe." That last sentence is the one worth carrying with you. Not as a general caution about home security, but as a statement about the logic of this crime. The sheriff of the county where this happened, the man overseeing the investigation, looked at the public and said, "What made Nancy Guthrie a target could make someone else a target too." He did not say the threat was random. He said the category that made her vulnerable is not unique to her. And he still has not said what that category is. If you want to follow this as it develops, and it will develop, this is the channel that will be here when it does. Every update, every lead, every time the silence breaks. Subscribing and turning on notifications takes 10 seconds. And right now, in a case this active, that is the difference between hearing about a breakthrough the day it happens and hearing about it a week later. As of this week, the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is in its 55th day, and what the public record contains is simultaneously more than it was a month ago, and far less than it should be. The forensic genetic genealogy analysis is ongoing. The DNA samples recovered from the property, the ones that did not belong to the restaurant worker whose material was on the discarded gloves, the ones the sheriff described as other DNA evidence still being analyzed, are being processed. The technique being used, which reconstructs family trees from partial genetic material and cross-references them against public genealogy databases, does not produce results quickly. It produced Brian Kohberger's name in the Idaho murders case, but that process unfolded over months, not days. Retired FBI agent Lance Leasing, who spoke to CBS News about the investigation's trajectory, was careful not to offer false hope about the timeline. He said the process takes a while. He also said that when it works, it works. The Bitcoin blockchain is still being watched. The wallet address included in the ransom note is public, its transaction history visible to anyone who looks. Blockchain forensics firms have stated publicly that the conversion of those funds into usable currency, the moment the holder tries to cash out through an exchange, creates an identifiable record. That moment has not yet arrived, or if it has not been publicly acknowledged. The FBI has not commented on the current status of the financial investigation. Additional gloves recovered near Nancy's home are still being tested at a private laboratory in Florida, according to Fox News Digital. The results of that testing have not been disclosed. The surveillance footage from cameras installed at the fence line and garage area of Nancy's property, reviewed by law enforcement sources and reported by CBS News, captured family members, landscapers, and pool workers in the weeks before the abduction, but nothing that investigators considered suspicious or worth releasing publicly. The Guthrie family released a statement on March 21st, reported by KVOA News 4, Tucson, that read in part, "Someone knows something." They wrote that it is possible a member of this community has information they do not even realize is significant. They asked specifically for memories, footage, journal notes, text messages, or conversations from around January 31st, the early morning hours of February 1st, and the late evening of January 11th. They wrote that no detail is too small. They wrote that it may be the key. The FBI tip line, at 1800-CALL-FBI, has received more than 13,000 calls since February 1st. The surge of more than 1,500 tips that came in after the family announced the $1 million reward is still being reviewed. Whether any of those tips has produced an actionable lead has not been confirmed. Nancy's brother Cameron, who spent his career in military and intelligence work, told Savannah in the hours after their mother went missing that he believed it was a kidnapping. He said it immediately, without hesitation, before the blood on the porch had been tested, before the camera footage had been recovered, before any of the evidence that would later confirm his assessment had been found. Savannah recounted this in her interview with Hoda Kotb, saying she did not want to believe him, and asking if he thought it was because of her. He told her maybe. She has carried that possibility for 55 days, and she said on camera that to think she brought this to her mother's bedside is too much to bear. That is not information relevant to who committed this crime, but it is relevant to what kind of crime this was. A person who plans a targeted abduction around the public profile of a family member is operating with a specific kind of calculation, a calculation that begins with watching, with learning, with understanding what a family would do to get someone back. And somewhere in the month before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, someone was making exactly that calculation, inside a neighborhood where she had lived quietly, in a house that had recently been entered by people she had trusted enough to let through her door. Two questions remain that this investigation has not answered, and they are the ones that will define whatever comes next. The first, who were the members of that electrical crew? When exactly were they in the house? And what has the investigation into their identities and movements produced? The second, what is the motive that Sheriff Nanos has known since day one, and has protected for 55 days? One of those questions points to a person, the other points to a reason. And somewhere between them is the answer that Nancy Guthrie's family has been waiting for since the morning of February 1st, when they walked into her house and found everything she owned still there, and her gone. The most dangerous assumption you can make about your home security is that the threat will come from someone you have never seen before. Every safety conversation about residential crime focuses on the stranger, the person who has no connection to your life, who selects a target randomly, who can be deterred by visible cameras and good lighting and a locked door. And those measures matter. But the Nancy Guthrie case is, at its core, a study in what happens when the threat does not come from outside that circle. When it comes from someone who was invited in, or from someone who received information from a person who was. If a contractor, service worker, or any crew is scheduled to work inside your home, the verification that most people skip is not the individual, it is the company. Who dispatched this crew? Who holds their employment records? Who can confirm, by name, each person who entered your property and on which date? In a case where an electrical crew was reportedly inside Nancy Guthrie's home in January and her disappearance followed weeks later, that paper trail, who made the appointment, who confirmed the visit, who was present is exactly what investigators need and may not have in complete form. Cloud backup on security cameras is not a convenience feature. It is, in this case, the reason any footage exists at all. The physical camera unit at Nancy Guthrie's front door was removed from the property. The footage that the FBI released on February 10th, the only known images of the suspect, survived because Nest's back-end systems retained residual data that forensic teams were able to reconstruct. If that footage had been stored only on a local device, it would be gone. Enable cloud recording on every camera in your system, and confirm that it is actively syncing, not just switched on. The pacemaker data in this case provided the most precise timestamp investigators had. 28 inches the morning on February 1st, the moment Nancy's device stopped communicating with her phone. Medical devices that sync with consumer technology generate forensic records that most families do not know exist. If you have a family member with a connected medical device, understanding what data it produces and how it can be accessed in an emergency is not a morbid precaution. In this case, it was a critical piece of evidence. What this case teaches us about ransom crime in the digital age is something that cuts against a decade of conventional wisdom. Bitcoin is not a shield, it is a ledger. Every transaction is recorded, every wallet has a history, and the moment that currency moves toward conversion, it moves toward exposure. The person or persons who demanded $6 million in Bitcoin from a grieving family made, according to multiple blockchain forensics experts, a traceable mistake. The question of whether that mistake has produced the result investigators need is one this channel will continue to follow. If you are watching this because you have been following Nancy Guthrie's case, you already understand why this story matters beyond the family at its center. It is a story about how much a determined person can learn about someone's private life before they ever make a move. It is a story about the gap between what investigators know and what they can say. And it is a story that is not finished. We began this video with a question that no official has answered in 55 days. Who provided the operational knowledge that made this crime possible? Not who wore the mask, not who carried the backpack. Who drew the map and handed it over, and watched the plan unfold from somewhere close enough to know exactly what was happening? That question is still open. The electrical crew has not been publicly identified or cleared. The motive that Sheriff Chris Nanos has protected since February 1st has not been released. The Bitcoin wallet is still being watched. The DNA is still being analyzed. And somewhere in Tucson, or somewhere connected to Tucson, a person is living with the weight of what they know. Murder Mystery File will be here for every development. When the silence breaks, and in a case this active, with this many parallel investigative threads still running, it will break this channel. We'll cover it the day it happens. If you are not subscribed, now is the time. Turn on notifications. This is not a case that is going to resolve quietly. One question, for anyone who has followed this from the beginning: if Sheriff Nanos has known the motive since day one, and has protected that information for 55 days while a family waits and a community watches, what could that motive possibly be that its disclosure, even now, would still put something at risk? Nancy Guthrie has not come home. And the person who knows where she is, they have been watching this story unfold alongside the rest of us, from the beginning.